All right, this is going to be my first live tie that I've done in a while. I've been really doing mostly my 60-second ties, so kind of cool to get back. What I'm going to do is, I guess the final product is going to be a Cahill, or at least closest to a Cahill, but really I'm just going to go over dry fly techniques in general. So there's a size 12 in the vise, and what I love for these is this Semperfli Nano Silk. It's hands down my favorite dry fly thread. Really strong, but really thin. It allows you to control a lot of different things. So we'll get that started right there at the eye. And because it's this GSP stuff, I cut that with a razor blade. My scissors will cut it, but it's a little bit of a pain. And what you want to do is make sure that every time you leave your thread off, you're leaving it at where you want something to be tied in. So I didn't stop that at a random place. I stopped that at the spot that's going to give me the amount of space right here that I want in front of my wings. Now for my wings, I'm going to use a couple pieces of this mallard dyed wood duck. And what I'm going to do, for most of my dries, I use 2 feathers, and I just kind of made them together like that. And then I turn them on their backside so that they splay away from each other. And I'm going to kind of bring it forward in my hand and really compress them down so I can get those tips aligned as much as possible. And once those tips are pretty much lined up, I'm going to really pinch down hard on that to keep them together. Measure out my length. And then get those tied in like that. And I'm going to do a pinch wrap here to really get that first wrap cinched in. And then we'll get a couple wraps behind. And it's going to roll on you a little bit, but you can just take it and roll it back. Hold it there on the top and really tighten it down. Make sure that's set. Now, the next step is actually a little important. You can just snip that off right there and then mess with the dubbing to get your taper, but I like everything to kind of follow the shape that I create. So I'm going to take my scissors, lay them flat, and then just angle them a little bit. So if I get the initial cut point right where my thread ended, and then angle that cut, I'm going to cut them at an angle like that. And then when I start to wrap backwards, you'll see that the body is going to take on that nice tapered shape that you're looking for. Okay. Now again, we didn't really go back all the way to the back of the hook, and that's for a reason, because the next thing that we got to do is tie in our tailing material. I like CDL for this stuff, and you know, if you don't have CDL, I think grabbing a patch of that is going to be well worth your while. It's relatively inexpensive, and the amount of feathers you get in those whiting tailing packs, I mean, you have tails for years. I mean, I don't think I'll ever run out of the CDL that I have. So we're going to go and say that's about a hook shank in length. I don't really measure my stuff that religiously. I just kind of tie it in with you know, how it looks good to me. That might be a little long, but that's not a problem. I can just back that off, reset it, get that first wrap nice and solid. That's pretty good right there. And I'm going to hold that straight as I wrap towards the back. That's going to help keep everything on top of the hook shank and keep everything aligned and nice and straight. And that's going to be our tail. So I'm going to work my way back up. And again, with that tapered shape that we created, it should continue to hold its shape. And when I get towards the top, I'm going to kind of bend that up a little bit and slip my scissor points in there and get that off. Now, if you make any mistakes with the taper, it's really not a huge deal because you can make up for it with dubbing. So don't think you got to be perfect with that. I just want to mash that down a little bit with a couple of tight wraps. All right, so I lost a little bit here. I didn't realize my phone kind of ran out of space. So what I did here is I started standing up the wings. And what I wanted to show you is that I only have about 5 wraps of a thread dam in front of the wings instead of a whole bunch. And look where the wings are, perfectly straight up and down. The reason why I only do a few wraps, is you really don't want a giant thread dam in front of your wings. Because if you do that, what's going to happen is when you wrap the hackle, that first wrap in front of the wings, if there's a giant thread dam there, what'll happen is it'll go up at an angle, and then your fibers will start splaying all over the place. So you don't need a really big thread dam. That's a really big mistake on a dry fly. Just a little bit to get those standing up. And then what'll happen is you can see how there's a little bit of a natural separation right there because we use 2 feathers. So what we'll do is we'll hold the backside feather and run our thread right in the middle there to keep them separated, and come around again, and then this time holding that back wing, I'm going to run some thread wraps right up the base to gather all those fibers and hold them together a little bit more. And then I'll do a couple wraps to save my work. Then I'm going to come around through the wings again, but this time wrap back around the base of the fibers that are closest to me, and with some real soft tension, I'm just going to run some wraps up the feather, tighten it down where I want it, and then take a couple of wraps to save my work. And then your wings will be nicely separated, and we're good to go. And I'm going to bring my thread towards the back, not all the way to the back, right to about the hook point or so, because I'm going to start dubbing my thread. Now, I do a really, really thin dub loop. This is going to be some light Cahill dry fly dubbing. Like I said, I'm just using what I have laying around the desk, so even though this is just a random dry, it's probably closest to a Cahill. So I dub my thread, I don't even know if you can see that, with a really, really light wisp of dubbing. Now, there's a lot of ways to dub a dry fly. I've seen a lot of people taper the dubbing on the thread so that you get the taper of the body. I like to taper my bodies just with the underbody and tying things in the right way. I like some dubbing. I don't like a ton of dubbing. I don't want a tiny amount of dubbing. I want kind of in the middle there. So as I go down, I am going to build up a little bit of a thicker noodle. But you can always add more. The reason why I like the thin noodle overall is because you can adjust your taper and get the shape that you want with your thread control. You know, if you're going with the underbody, if you screw up the underbody, then there's no way you're going to get the shape you want. But with a nice thin thread or noodle thread, you can kind of shape it however you like. I got some random strands here, so I'm going to angle it backwards to get that back by the tail. I'm going to hold my tail tight so I don't wrap any fibers around, and I'm going to start making touching wraps up the body, filling in gaps wherever I think I need to fill in a gap. We're going to keep adjusting to get that tapered look. And again, you can always add more dubbing if you need it. So as I get further up and I start to run out, I'm just going to go and put more on. I usually always have to dub my thread twice on a dry fly. I mean, if I was tying a bunch of these, I could probably really go crazy and make sure I can get it done all in one, but that's really not necessary. So this is going to be a little shorter because I don't need as much. Get that up to the front. I want a little bit more here for a taper. And we're good. And there's your body. Now, last step is the hackle, where we're going to do some things here. I'm going to use a feather off of a silver graded barred ginger. And notice that one side of the feather, I've got the barb stripped off. Now, normally I do not do that, but the reason why I'm doing that is because the feather that I'm using has probably the thickest barb density of any piece of hackle I've ever bought. So by stripping off one side with this specific hackle, it makes the fly look the way I want it to look. If I leave them there, it's going to be a real bushy dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get that tied in close to me with a loose wrap there and tighten it down. I'll make one wrap on the other side just to help stand that up straight. And then I'm just going to run my thread right down. And I do wrap in a little bit of the stem in the front part just because I want a little bit of bulk there. I'll get that out of there. Okay, so we come forward, and I'm going to hold my thread in the bobbin holder. Now, for the hackle, you want that first wrap nice and tight so that it lays perfectly perpendicular to the shank. Get that nice and tight, exactly how we want it, just like that. And then every wrap after that, just make sure that it's butting up against the previous wrap. And once you get a couple wraps going, it should kind of guide itself. But at the bottom here, watch my hand. I'm going to kick it out a little bit as I wrap it forward. And the reason why is when you make that bottom wrap, that's usually when you start catching fibers. So if you're ever wrapping a dry fly and you see some of your fibers start to kind of like lean forward a little bit, that's what you're doing. Now also, see when I make this wrap, how that wing starts to bend forward? That kind of means that I've made as many wraps as I could make behind the wing. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this firmly. I'm going to hold my wings back, and I'm going to get a nice firm wrap right in front of those wings. And then continue on with touching wraps moving forward. I mean, this feather is just so long, I've got to like whip the excess of it out of my way. And you can go all the way to the eye, but I stop a little short. And here's how I tie off my dry flies. Feather straight up in the air, make a cinching wrap. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a couple of wraps forward to cinch that down. Now if I cut that feather right now, what's going to happen is the excess that I'm cutting off is going to be kind of leaning towards the front of the fly, and it's going to stick out and you're going to see it. I don't want that. So I'm going to take that feather, bend it back, and run a couple of thread wraps over it. That way, when I slip my scissors in here and cut that tiny little bit of feather is hidden back behind the hackle, and you're never going to see it. So we'll make a couple of wraps there to kind of finish that off. And we'll finish with a quick whip finish here. I do color the head most of the time, but I'm going to leave that there. Again, I cut this with a razor blade, so we'll get that out of there. And I did mangle these wings a little bit, so we'll just straighten them out a little. And there you go. I mean, again, I know technically this is a Cahill, but again, that's just because that's all I had laying around. But either way, that's how you get a nice tapered body, good split wings. And as I said, that hackle is just really dense with big, thick fibers, which is why I usually strip it. Normal hackle, I don't strip the sides. But that's it. Pretty straightforward dry fly. There's a lot of little things there that if you kind of pay attention to, get your hackle straight up and down, good tapered body, you'll get the look that you're looking for. Okay. Appreciate the view. Let me know if you have any questions or anything in the comments, and subscribe.